Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Bring up the spring-loaded weapon platform. No, that doesn't sound. Bring up the spigot-firing mortar. Still a bit too low. Bring up the PIAT. Yes, there it is. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm Kevin Getz. I'm your co-host, glider pilot number 2 in our podcast. I'm sitting here at the Horsa and Groom. I've ordered my drink ready, and there's my partner, Andy. Andy, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing exceptionally well, actually. And I heard that as I sat down, your intro, and I'm very impressed, mate. That was brilliant. Kudos to you. But yeah, not doing too bad at all, thanks. It's going to be another great episode coming up. I can feel it in my bones.
Isn't it, though? And if our listeners haven't already guessed, I think we're going to be talking about the PIAT, and I can't think of any better guest than to have a seat with us here at the Horsa and Groom and discuss his book, The PIAT, Britain's Anti-tank Weapon of WWII. You may not know the author from the book, but you may know him from fighting on film. Matthew Moss, welcome to the Horsa and Groom. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, fellas. This is the first time I've been in the pub since it got its name, I think. I was on with Robbie, my co-host of Fight on Film, a couple of months ago, I guess, and it didn't even have a name yet at that point.
No, it didn't. In fact, it was We Have Ways Fest when we finally announced to our listeners the name of our beautiful pub. And speaking of which, Matthew, you're the guest. What are you drinking?
I am on a very respectable cup of tea tonight. I'm being very good.
There we go. Ugh, I'm not even going to ask. Just tell the audience, Andy.
It's a pint of the black stuff.
Well, I'm going with a Smithwick red ale in a lovely glass. So, gentlemen, raise a glass. Cheers.
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 Let's get this show on the road. Matt, so getting right into it, what actually drew you to the PIAT? And can you describe for us the process of creating the book and how you actually came about writing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2018, I published a book with Osprey about the Sterling submachine gun, which was a great process, and I really enjoyed doing that. That was my first book. And then they asked if I had any follow-ups, anything I wanted to do within their weapons series. And they had a list of things that they wanted books about, and all of them were pretty common small arms light weapons, as we call them. Various assault rifles, etc., that kind of thing. And I could have done a book on a couple of them out of the list. But one that was near the bottom, in the bottom third, so to speak, was the PIAT. And I immediately thought of A Bridge Too Far, the iconic scene, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on as well, where Anthony Hopkins, as Colonel John Frost, calls up the PIAT as the Leopard 1 trundles towards them. And I immediately thought, I've never seen anyone else write anything substantial on the PIAT. I've never seen anything more than articles in magazines or online. There was just very little information out there, and I knew that was going to require a substantial amount of primary research. And I just thought that'd be a really fun challenge. It's a weapon that I think is probably misunderstood because we'll talk about the myths, I'm sure, but I understood it to be that, it's just a spring-powered, British bazooka and, all this rubbish. And I knew that wasn't the case because there's a lot more going on. You can see that even from just watching Bridge Too Far. So I thought, I'm going to go for the PIAT. So I put in for the PIAT and I said, I'll happily write a book about that, but you might need to give me a little bit longer than usual as it's going to require a lot of primary research, digging into archives. And that was it for the next 18 months. I was in archives. I was talking to people. I was reaching out to museums all around the world because obviously it's a Dominion and Empire weapon as well. So you've got Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, all using the PIAT. So I'm reaching out to all these museums around the world and trying to find out what kind of information they have. I started with just getting the basics down. There wasn't a great deal of primary material readily available. So I picked up as many of the contemporary published pamphlets as I could. So I ended up picking up the Bombard and PIAT pamphlets and started digging through those and got the basic kind of understanding of the weapon's capability, how it worked, and how people were trained to use it, which is the really important thing. And I'm a human historian where I find the human side of history just as interesting as, say, the mechanical side, because I am by speciality and focus a historian of small arms and light weapons. So I study weapons that soldiers use. So you would think automatically that I'm very interested in mechanical and how they're designed and how they're made, and I am, but I'm also really interested in how soldiers use their weapons. So learning how they're trained to use them and then digging in and trying to find out how they were used in the field is, I would say, about 50% of my approach. So yeah, so I started to dig in. I was lucky enough to find out that the ICI, the Imperial Chemicals Company, their archive is in Middlesbrough. So I managed to get up there and have a look at their archive, dig through engineering drawings, little bits of corporate ephemera that had been kept. Like there was a luncheon in 1944 for a couple of VC winners and the main staff that had been on the development team for the Piat to celebrate the accomplishments of the two VC winners. They had one of those, and they had like a little pamphlet that the ICI had printed in 45 explaining the Piat and how it was developed and all that kind of thing. Just really loads of really good information and endless design drawings, which was really important for getting a handle on the iterations of the design. Basically, a lot of archival digging, speaking to museums, and then just kind of going through photo archives as well. So that was a real key one, and finding photographs of it in the field being used. I went through probably 150 audio interviews on the Imperial War Museum's archive, listening because they didn't do transcripts of them. I believe they're about to do AI stuff and have transcripts of them all, which will be super amazing and great. But basically what I did was I searched Piat and Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, which is the full name of the Piat, in their archive and dug out all the ones that had Piat tags in them. So there was some sort of mention, but it didn't explain how much of a mention. Some of them, it was like, oh yeah, I was trained on the Piat. Others were like Wagger Thornton talking about whether it was a decent weapon or not and what he thought about it. That kind of level of stuff was in there. So that was a really time-consuming element of the research for the book, was sitting down and transcribing by hand all of these various bits of interview. And sadly, a lot of them didn't make it into the book. And by Osprey's choice, we didn't quote them directly because there was something about trademarks and whether it was copyright to the Imperial War Museum, although it wasn't. And I'd done it for my previous book. So that was a little bit disappointing, but I'll use them again in the future. So yeah, it took about 18 months to research and write, and then it came out in 2020, and it was really gratifying to see it in the world and to dispel some of the myths around the Piat and finally put out something that was substantial and gave like a good overview, in my opinion anyway, of the Piat's development and use, because it's a fascinating weapon. I've always found it really interesting.
You started speaking about the development of the Piat there. So as far as the development of the Piat, can you describe for us like the transition process from the boys anti-tank rifle, which was in use at the start of the war, to this new anti-tank system in the Piat?
Yeah, so obviously when the Piat came into service in 1943, it was revolutionary. The British Army at the time, the main platoon anti-tank weapon was the boys, and then of course they also had the number 68 rifle grenades, and they also had the number 74 sticky bombs and the 75 Hawkins mines. In terms of the grenades, pretty decent kit for the 42, 43. But the boys, when it came in 37, was arguably already on the obsolescent side of things, firing a .55 cartridge, which is very big. But even so, it wasn't going to be able to penetrate the armor of, say, a Panzer III. And you can see through the iterations of British Army training pamphlets that they quantify that, okay, this is for light armored vehicles. Don't be expecting to knock out a tank with this. Even by 1940, they kind of had an understanding that it was going to be an ask. So they were talking about targeting vision slits, the gun mantlets, the turret traverse ring, trying to literally explain that you need to try and create bearing on the turret traverse to prevent the gun from traversing. So, that kind of desperate level of where you're aiming, and aiming a boy's anti-tank rifle under, the threat of a Panzer coming at you, it's not the easiest thing. You aren't really going to be hitting those pinpoint points like the vision slits and the turret ring. So clearly by 1940, there was an understanding that we needed something better, coupled with the fact that after the evacuation from Dunkirk, we left an awful lot of anti-tank guns, 2-pounders, and Hotchkiss 20mm as well in France. So the British Army's establishment of actual battalion anti-tank weapons and brigade and divisional anti-tank weapons was relatively low as well at that point, and in real dire straits. So in 1940-41, you get what's called the Blacker Bombard, or the 29mm spigot mortar, which was a development of Colonel LBS Blacker, who was a fascinating character, career soldier, adventurer, flew on one of the first flights to fly over the summit of Everest and take photographs. Actually a veteran of the Royal Flying Corps in World War I, had been in India in the Indian Army in the 30s. So a really fascinating character, very eccentric, monocle, very self-assured, fascinated by ancient weaponry, hence the name Bombard. And basically what he developed in the 1930s was a series of spigot-based weapons. Now, spigots are the converse of a conventional mortar. So if you take a conventional mortar, you understand it as it's a big tube, not rifled like an artillery piece, but it's a big smoothbore tube with an anvil at the bottom or a firing pin. And you drop a bomb down that, the bomb goes down the tube, hits the anvil, and detonates and is fired out the tube. And the spigot is the converse of that. So basically, a spigot is an iron rod or a steel rod. And in weapons terms, it's a steel rod that you slide a bomb onto, and then the actual propellant cartridge of the mortar bomb is in the tail of the bomb. And when that detonates, it compresses, and the pressure in the tube causes it to expand against the spigot face, and that pushes it off the spigot and downrange. So the way spigot mortars work is that they are either fixed or they're dynamic. In the bombard's case, it was a fixed spigot, so the spigot didn't move. It was on a big 4-footed mount that was set up, or in a lot of cases on a big concrete plinth, which is the biggest kind of remaining element of the Blacker bombard that you see around. They're dotted around the English countryside, and they were put on airfields and on stop lines and on coastal positions and all sorts of interesting places as an anti-tank position in 1941. Basically, what the idea was with the bombard was it was cheap and quick. So it was developed, and it would give a really pretty decent anti-tank capability to a defensive position, or when it was issued to the field army, which it was, contrary to popular belief, it would become a battalion anti-tank weapon, kind of in the role of a 2-pounder. So what you end up with is a spigot mortar which can fire a 20-pound bomb filled with high explosive, and these were known as HESH, or squash head. So what it was a high explosive squash head. So the bomb would strike whatever it was going to hit, in theory a tank, and it would compress against the tank's hull and then blow inwards, and it would shatter the tank's hull and blast inwards and knock the vehicle out. That works very differently to how the Piat's actual bomb works, but we'll talk about that later. So there's substantial differences to the bombard, but it is the beginning of the British Army's appreciation for the concept of a spigot-based weapon, which is not something we'd ever really tried. We'd looked at some of Blacker's designs in the mid-30s. In fact, the 2-inch mortar went up against a Blacker design called the Arbalest, or the Arbalest. Again, one of those ancient weapon names that Blacker was so fond of. And what the Arbalest brought to the table was it could fire a mortar bomb, conventional mortar bomb, from a spring off a spigot. That did not get selected. They went with the Spanish design, which became the 2-inch mortar, which is probably a good idea. Good job they did. So the British Army's looking at these. They've kind of turned them down pre-war, but by 1940, we're all getting a bit desperate. Spigots, become somewhat more kind of practical. They're what's known as sub-artillery. So the bombard gets lumped in with things like the Northover projector and the Smith gun, which the Home Guard predominantly are equipped with. But the bombard is considered more of a practical weapon. It does get issued to the field army, and it does get issued around the country to defend things like coastal batteries. In my book, there's a couple of accounts of guys that were trained from the Royal Artillery coastal batteries, but they were trained on Blacker bombards because they were worried that if Germans landed, they would need some kind of anti-tank defensive capability to defend the guns. So you do see regular army use of the bombard, and that kind of the origins of the spigot being accepted as a viable concept. Come 1942, Blacker has designed a slightly smaller spigot-based weapon, and that's kind of developed in and around known as military intelligence research, which was a very small section within the British Army's military intelligence sections, which later went on to become MD1, which is Ministry of Defence 1, which was perhaps best known as Churchill's toy shop that developed all these cool gadgets and explosives and weapons, the Piat being one of those. And the section commander of military intelligence research was a chap called Colonel Jeffress, and he was tasked with developing an anti-tank capability for the platoon to replace the boys. So he knew that Blacker had developed this slightly smaller version of the bombard. The bombard is a substantially large weapon. It's very heavy. You can't really set that up rapidly in the field. If you watch videos of it being used on YouTube, you'll instantly see why. It's a substantial beast. It's not a platoon weapon. So a smaller version of that seems like a good idea. So what they did was they basically took Blacker's design, and Jeffress made his own tweaks. He basically phoned Blacker and said, "I'd like to work on your design a little bit if you don't mind," and Blacker was fine with this. So they developed it slightly, and after some initial testing, it was sent off to ICI, who had already been instrumental in developing the Bombard and the Bombard's munitions, the bombs that it fired. So there was an anti-personnel and a high explosive round that was developed for the Bombard. So they seemed best placed for this. They understood what was needed and sort of the technology at work. So they took these two designs. They took Blacker's design, they took Jeffress's design, and they tested both of them. And initially, Jeffress's looked like it was going to be the answer. That looked like the most refined of the two. One of the best things I found while researching was in an archive in Oxford, at Oxford University, and I found in some private papers original photographs of the Jeffress prototype. And they made it into the book, so I was super thrilled with that. As a historian, that's one of those moments where it's just chef's kiss. Amazing. You can't find better things than that. Things that have never been seen before, never been published, and it just beautiful. I've not yet been able to find a drawing or a photograph of the actual weapon that Blacker developed, this early concept. There's some drawings that I think may allude to it, but can't be quite certain of that. But we have photographs of the Jeffress design. ICI take these two designs and they work on them for about 6 to 8 months. And they finally find out that neither are perfect. The Jeffress design isn't quite as good as they thought it was going to be. The Blacker design kind of comes to the fore. And what they end up doing is they end up combining elements from Jeffress's, Blacker's, and their own work into a fourth design. So there's a fourth, and it's called the Type D. And that's what eventually becomes the Piat. And the Piat basically is a dynamic spigot mortar. So rather than being a fixed spigot, which the spigot doesn't move and the bomb just fires off it, and the ground takes up all that recoil energy, which is substantial if you're firing a 20-pound high explosive bomb. In the Piat's case, it has to be fired from the shoulder, and it was supposed to be below 30 pounds because the buoys actually weighs in at 35 pounds unloaded and 38 pounds loaded, and that's heavy. That's heavy. So you see photos of like two guys carrying them. One's on the muzzle, one's on the buttstock. Because if you're carrying 40 pounds or 35 pounds of rifle for a route march of like 6 hours, you're done at the end of that. That's really substantial. So the idea was you'd have a 25 to 28 pound anti-tank weapon that could replace it, and that was the aim with the Piat. They didn't quite hit that. They got to around 30, 32 once everything came into production. But it was still substantially lighter and a lot more capable than the Boys. The Boys was capable of penetrating about 23 millimeters, which is just under an inch at 100 yards. You compare that to the Piat, it can penetrate about 4.5 inches, which is, So the only thing that really was better than the Piat by the end of the war was some of the German Panzerfaust stuff. The range on those was significantly less than a Piat's. So fast forward to 1943, development's finished, production's underway, and they finally get it into service, and it debuts in North Africa during the Tunis campaign. It doesn't, we don't think, knock out any vehicles during the campaign. There's some great photographs of small arms school corps guys doing a training tour. Basically, they take out the first batch of Piats out to the theatre. They're training guys in theatre on this new weapon. The pamphlets, the ink on them is literally, fresh. They're doing their first in-field testing, basically, in Tunis. And it hits its first successes in Sicily, which is, about 4 or 5 months later. And from there, it's used everywhere. Northwest Europe, Italy, in the Far East against the Japanese. It's used everywhere with varying degrees of usefulness. There's some interesting trials reports of them firing them against bamboo bunkers, not doing particularly well because high explosive, well, actually, I should say, shape charge warheads don't do particularly well against soft materials. They need something hard to have an effect, and preferably metal. But if you take Ganji Lama's VC action, you can see that they're super effective against Hargo Type 95 tanks. Knocks out 2 of those in quick succession. There's a couple of other good instances of Piat use in the Far East as well. It's used a lot in its secondary indirect fire role as well in the Far East.
It's all fascinating stuff, Matt. Thanks ever so much so far. But I'd like to take this opportunity very quickly just to remind our listeners that if they're enjoying this episode, to give us a like, follow, subscribe, wherever you're listening to us. And don't forget, we now have a new Patreon page where you can follow us for as little as £2.50 a month. Moving on to the next question. The Piat is now in service with the British Army in most of the theatres of the Second World War. But specifically, as far as the airborne's concerned, how are they actually getting this thing into action? What does a PIAT team look like? Obviously, if it's with air landing guys, they're going to take it in the back of a glider, but how are the paratroopers actually going to get this thing on the ground?
Great question. So the airborne troops and air landing troops, the PIAT team looks exactly the same as the regular field army. So you have a two-man team. You have a number one and a number two. Number one is the gunner. Number two is the loader. Basically, the way a PIAT works in practice is it has to be cocked first. And this is where the whole spring-powered myth thing comes from. Basically, a PIAT, as I mentioned earlier, is a dynamic spigot. So what that means is the spigot moves. It just moves backwards and forwards. And it's best to think about the spigot in terms of the PIAT as the firing pin. So if you're familiar with firearms have a firing pin. The firing pin ignites the cartridge, which is loaded into the weapon, and that fires the bullet downrange. So in a PIAT, the number two will load the tray with the bomb. So at the front of the PIAT, there is an opening where the spigot will project through when it's fired. So what happens is there is a pair of guides on the front of the front plate of a PIAT. And what happens there is on the rear of the bomb, there's a corresponding ring that you have to seat between those two guides. And that basically holds the bomb in place in the bomb tray. So that's the number two's job. He has to load with his right hand. So he's lying down, he's on the left-hand side of the number one, and he will nose the bomb in through the front kind of ring, then place the tail down firmly against the guide at the rear, and that will hook in. What that enables you to do is you can now fire in from an elevated position downwards without the bomb falling out the tray, which is great. Last thing you want when you're firing a PIAT is for the bomb to slip out the tray. Super unideal. The second more important element in terms of successful operation is that lines the spigot up with the tail tube of the bomb. So the spigot now has a clear run through the tube to detonate the propellant cartridge, which is in the base of the bomb body at the end of the tube. So the spigot runs through the tube to the propellant cartridge, which is kind of akin to a 12-gauge shotgun load, but a little bit hotter. It's made of brass, and the spigot moves through the tube, detonates that cartridge, and then, as I said earlier, the propellant gases expand, push against the spigot, and because the bomb isn't attached to the PIAT by any more than spring steel from this little ring, the gases are enough to push the bomb off the spigot downrange. So you can expect a PIAT bomb to travel in the direct fire roll about 120 yards, which is about 110 meters, give or take. And in the indirect roll, which is, I think, the PIAT's kind of hidden quality, which isn't too widely known, but it was really, really useful, about 350 yards. So in the indirect roll, you use it like an actual mortar. You tilt it up about 60, 70 degrees. You aim with a almost traditional kind of like spirit level mortar tangent sight, and you're able to use the weapon in the indirect then, which is really great. Secondary kind of role. And the British Army was quick to realize this. They kind of start talking about this in mid-1943, and they're like, Can we get an indirect line, fire line, like a white line painted along the top of this to help guys aim it? And then can we get the monopod to have adjustable positions for raising the weapon up? Can we get a tangent sight on this? And ICI were like, yep, we can do that, no problem. Because initially, when they were testing it, they actually fitted an actual 3-inch mortar rear tangent sight and just a mortar's bipod legs to test it, and it actually did work. So they knew it could do this, but they hadn't really put it into doctrine at this point, and that kind of evolved organically and became like a really useful element of the PIAT. And there's lots of really good accounts of chaps using the PIAT in that way, on the Po River against dug-in German positions in Italy and right throughout Northwest Europe and in the Far East as well. So getting back to it, basically the number one holds on for grim life, essentially. When he pulls the trigger, the 12-pound spigot and spigot body slams forward, hits the bomb, as I said, and ignites the propellant cartridge. The propellant cartridge then thrusts the actual spigot and spigot guide body back. So it's like the bolt of a firearm, and it gets pushed back against this big, powerful spring. So there's a spring that weighs about 12 pounds inside the PIAT, and it recoils against this moving spigot. And basically, it has a velocity of about 25 feet per second, moving backwards. So it was quickly realized that to meet that British Army requirement of firing from the shoulder, there's no way they couldn't do it without some sort of recoil mitigation. And they looked at hydraulic, they looked at springs, and springs became kind of like the obvious thing. And when you're firing a 2.5 to 3 pound bomb and it needs to go out at least 100 yards. The amount of pressure that's needed to do that is significant. So if they hadn't had recoil mitigation, it would have just disabled guys. And the Piat had a reputation for doing that anyway, because basically, if you've ever fired a shotgun, you'll know that if you limp wrist a shotgun and you hold it out of your shoulder pocket, it hammers you really hard, and you don't do it again. It's the same with any high power weapon. For the listener, the guys are nodding. And basically, the key to firing a high power weapon or a Piat is you keep it in the shoulder, you keep it buried in the shoulder, and you keep it there. So what you end up with, rather than a kick, is a long push. And all the veterans' accounts that I listened to when they talked about using it and training on it, when I listened to all those IWM audio recordings with veterans, they all talk about either it kicked or it felt like a long push. And they talk about, being told to keep it tight in the pocket of the shoulder, because if you don't, A, it really hurts, and B, it doesn't recock itself. So you have to provide a solid platform against which it recoils for that spring to recock itself and compress far enough for the sear inside the Piat to reset. So it's just like a semi-automatic firearm in that respect. You pull the trigger, it releases the sear, that releases the spring, and the spigot gets shot forward, and that's how it works. So if you don't have a stable platform for it to recoil against and for that spring to compress again, then it doesn't recock. And at that point, what you've got to do is, if you're under fire, you've got to roll over onto your back, unlatch the butt plate, put your feet on it like a pair of stirrups, and push it away from you, and then pull it back. And basically, you're manually compressing the spring. Ideally, if you were preparing to go out on a fighting patrol or you're expecting contact with the enemy, you would cock the weapon first and you would walk around with the weapon cocked. They wouldn't carry it with a bomb in the bomb tray. Typically, the number 2 would load them once contact was made or once they had a target that they knew they wanted to engage. There are some really great photographs from the ICI's archives of chaps. Essentially, if you've ever seen the Bren carried in the assault position where it's kind of like the low ready, it's the exact same thing but with a Piat. And it looks very alley. It looks great, but I think that made it into the book as well. That was one of those great photographs I found.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's got like a sling on and he's carrying it the low ready, and it's just really. But in practice, they carried it without a bomb in the tray because it was safer, because the bomb is fused by a impact detonated fuse. So if you chip over, you're firing off a Piat bomb without even firing it downrange because you've hit the impact fuse. They actually had some problems with the fuses because throughout their use in Italy, they realized that they were glancing off of targets. So if you have a tank with slightly sloped hull armor or a target with any kind of slope, they realized that the impact needed for the fuse to detonate the bomb was quite significant because they wanted it to be safe. So what they did was they iterated the fuse type to a graze fuse, which means it only had to sort of like graze the target for it to detonate. So the way they got round that being, the safety element of that was they designed a fuse that would arm itself in flight by inertia. The Piats pretty much developed. It doesn't change a great deal in 1943. They're still working on the ammunition, and there's 4 marks of ammunition that they move through. They changed the filling of the ammunition. They moved from TNT to RDX, like a 50-50 of plastic explosive and another compound. They changed the fuses quite a bit. They also, on another dangerous failure of the Piat's initial design, was they realized quite quickly that firers were being wounded by bits of shrapnel, which were being fired back towards them. So there was a number of incidents where the number 1 was quite badly injured by fragments of the brass propellant cartridge case. When it ignited and detonated, it blew into small chunks, and it essentially, as it detonated the main shaped charge, it fired back down whatever was left of the tube, and essentially the tube became a guidance barrel and fired it straight back towards the Piat team. So they realized, okay, well, there's fragments coming down, so we need to alter the composition of the propellant cartridge as well. So that was another kind of small iterative change they made. The biggest physical change they made, obviously, was going from an A-frame monopod to the classic single adjustable telescoping monopod, which you see. But getting back to the question at hand of how did the airborne guys get it into the field? As I say, there was just the 2 of them, so it was a gunner and a loader. The loader would typically carry 2 bomb carriers, which were cardboard tubes. If you buy a poster online or you get some wrapping paper at Christmas, it's a big cardboard tube, which is reinforced with steel wire. And each one holds 3 roughly 3-pound bombs. So you're carrying around the equivalent of about 10 pounds in each hand if you're carrying 2 of those at the ready. As I said, the Piat itself wasn't carried loaded. So they'd just be carrying the 35 pounds worth of Piat. In terms of how they landed them with airborne forces, basically, as you mentioned, there was a leg bag that was developed. It's the same with any kind of drop bag. Once they were out of the plane, they would release it and it would dangle about 5 meters or whatever it was on the rope. And it would land first in a canvas bag and then they'd get it out. But as you can imagine, that's great and everything. But if you're hitting the floor at whatever the velocity of a paratrooper is, or you're a Piat that weighs 35 pounds, it's moving with a considerable amount of force, and there's a propensity for damage. The Piat is a very robust weapon, but if you're dropping it on the ground, there's definitely going to be damage at some point. So what they ended up doing is they use the same load carrying containers that they normally drop arms and ammunition with paratroopers. There's evidence that they were thinking about this as soon as it was developed, because ICI also have photographs of potential loadout and arrangement of putting 2 Piats into one of these, and that's essentially how they were dropped, either by a leg bag or via a container with its own parachute. And essentially, once it was on the ground, it was carried either over the shoulder, or there's some great photographs of chaps with commandeered bikes, putting them on the sides of bikes. Sometimes they had the airborne trailers that they could throw things into and that kind of thing. So yeah, you end up with, once it's on the ground, they move it in any way they can.
Matt, during your research, what did you find out about the Piat's effectiveness in general through the Second World War, and specifically, for example, its use during the Battle of Arnhem?
I think there's a misunderstanding around the Piat that it was this spring-powered kind of comic weapon, whereas, as I've already mentioned, it wasn't spring-powered at all. The effectiveness of it was, at the time when it arrived in service, was better than anything else that was available. A well-trained Piat team, a number 1, number 2, they can fire 4 rounds a minute if the weapon cocks itself properly. So, as I said, you've got to keep it firm in the shoulder and you've got to make sure it cycles cleanly. But if it does, you can fire 3, 4, 5 rounds a minute, and that is substantial. If you take, say, a M1A1 bazooka, the American rocket launcher, which came into service just at the same time as the Piat did, you have to attach a pair of wire contacts at the rear to the electronic firing system of a rocket launcher. That adds time. So you can fire a bazooka maybe twice a minute, two, three times a minute. So the Piat has the advantage of being more rapid in firing. The Piat has the advantage of being quieter. There's a loud bang when the propellant cartridge is fired, but there's limited flash because it's all inside the bomb tube. There's limited report. With a bazooka or any kind of rocket launcher or a recoilless weapon like a Panzerfaust, you have a big jet of smoke, flash, and a characteristic shriek as it's fired. You don't have that with the Piat. The Piat has the fact that it has the indirect fire capability, so you can use it as a mortar. You can fire over defilade. You can fire over buildings. Major Kane in Arnhem was wounded while firing a Piat over a building at a Stug in the indirect role, trying to drop rounds onto a Stug that was just out of safe firing position. So he had a spotter in the building. He fired over the building and was trying to drop rounds when the building was damaged and he was wounded and his spotter was killed. So that indirect fire is super useful. In terms of its armor penetration capability, it's actually one of the best weapons of the war. The Piat could penetrate 4 to 4.5 inches of rolled homogeneous steel armor plate when it's fired in the direct roll. The M1 rocket launcher could penetrate to best 3 inches. The M9, which came in towards the end of the war, could penetrate 4. The Panzerfaust 30, with its limited range of about 30 yards or 30 meters, 5.5 inches, which is great, but it's a third of the range of a Piat. So again, the Piat is understood to be this short-range, useless weapon where you have to get super close to be sure of hitting anything. It's a bit of a myth. There's truth to it, and as with all good myths, there is elements of truth to it. You did have to be relatively close, much closer than you would have liked to have been. But if you were using a boy's anti-tank rifle, you could only hope to penetrate about an inch of armor at 100 yards. At 500 yards, which is the maximum effective range of a boy's anti-tank rifle, you could expect to penetrate about a quarter of that because of the exponential reduction in velocity. The way a Piat works is it has a shaped charge warhead, which means there's plastic explosive packed around a steel cone, and the steel cone is a forcing cone which directs the energy of the blast. The simplest way of explaining it is like a superheated jet of energy and molten metal. And that's what penetrates armor. And that's the technology that all of the infantry anti-tank weapons use and moved on to. The concept of the Hesh round that the bombard used wasn't efficient enough. It didn't provide enough punch at that size. So if you take, for instance, in terms of effectiveness, if you take a number 68 rifle grenade, which is itself a shaped charge, it's a very small grenade. It's about 3-4 inches of warhead and then tail that's fired from a cup discharge on a Lee Enfield. So what you end up with is a very small charge that isn't capable of penetrating a great deal. If you are relying on that, or a buoys, or God forbid, a sticky bomb, a number 74 sticky bomb, that you have to actually reach out and touch the tank almost. You can throw a sticky bomb as far as you can, just like a gammon bomb or a Hawkins mine. You can throw all of those, but then you have to be within throwing distance, which is what, 20 feet, 30 feet? If you want a practiced bowler. The Piat gives you a standoff range of 50 yards. Say if you want to be sure of hitting something 50 yards, which is still very close and not the kind of range you want to be at with a tank. But if you're an infantryman in the British Army in 1944, 43, 45, and you encounter armoured vehicles, the Piat is the best thing you can possibly have, because they've eluded the 6-pounders, they've eluded the 17-pounders. There's nothing else in the area, obviously. Bring up the Piat is called, then the Piat is the best thing that you've got available within the platoon and the section. And what it does is it provides the infantryman with a really credible way of knocking out any German armour. So from the Panzer IV through to the Tiger, through to the Panther, yes, its effectiveness is reduced, but it can still penetrate the side and rear armour of even the best German tanks, because it can. Basically, the Piat isn't bested by German armour throughout the war. If you add spaced and standoff armour to that, then it becomes a little bit less effective. But in the desert, it was tested against a Mark IV, a Panzer Mark IV, with spaced armour. It penetrated and caused enough damage inside to credibly knock it out. Once you increase the amount of standoff, or you increase the thickness of the armour that's standing off from the actual tank's main armour, then the effectiveness of any anti-tank weapon degrades. But in 1944-45, the Piat was arguably, I would say, the best anti-tank weapon of any nation, until things like the M9 bazooka come in. It's a point that I make in my book. The Piat is an evolutionary dead end. There are limits on what you can do with a Piat. They realize this even during the war, because there's a limit to what the human body can take. So the reason the bomb is only 2.5 to 3 pounds is that equal opposites, the laws of physics come into this. If you want to fire a bigger bomb at a greater range, the amount of recoil is bigger. And the human body can't sustain more recoil force than that the Piat already creates. So they do extensive testing of the length of spring and the weight of spring and the tensile strength, and they end up doing a process which is called scragging, where they compress and release on the production element on an industrial scale, which extends the life of a spring. So they go from having a spring that can fire, they think, 200 times to a spring that can fire 1,000 rounds. They come to realize that these are going to be used as indirect fire weapons. These are going to be used quite regularly against things that aren't tanks. They're going to be used against houses, pillboxes, all manner of different things. So in terms of effectiveness, outside of the simple metric of can it penetrate a tank's armour at 100 yards, Piat can do that no problem. Frontal armour up to a Mark IV, up to a Tiger, probably. Side armour, most German armour of the war, a Mark IV Piat round can pretty much penetrate. You have to be able to hit the thing, though. So you have to be able to aim. And this is where skill comes in. So a lot of the times when accounts talk about we wanted to get close to make sure, they wanted to get close to make sure they hit it with the first round. And it's the same with any anti-tank weapon. You don't know where that round's going to go because you don't have what they later introduced on weapons in the Cold War was like a spotting round, like a Law 80 in the British parlance or a SMOR in the US. They have a spotting rifle, and you can fire a 9mm cartridge downrange, and it will show you where the bullet and where the actual warhead that you're going to fire is going to go. They didn't have that luxury. So you had to be relatively sure that once you were within range of a tank, you were going to hit it and hit it somewhere useful. There's an element of a great deal of skill at large within these guys. And they didn't get a great deal of time training on these things. The manual lays down that there's going to be about 3 lessons. One of those is classroom, one of those is practical handling. And then they might get a chance to fire a live round, but more commonly they'd be firing practice rounds, which are a cast iron bar which is loaded into the bomb tray, and it's weighted and mimics the actual Piat's round. So basically, it's an inert shot, and you just fire that at a target downrange. And most guys, they only ever got to fire one of those. They never fired a live round during training. Some guys never fired them during training, but they still used them in the field. There's a great book called Stationed Out Here by Hugh McDonald Fraser that talks about, he gets thrust into being the Piat expert patrol because he's seen one before. He's never fired one, but he's seen it before. And that's out in the Far East. And he ends up, I think in the book, he ends up out engaging a raft of Japanese troops. And it takes a couple of rounds, but he does hit the raft, which is incredible. So effectiveness is a tricky one to gauge, but you can understand the metric that if you go top trumps or you go on Wikipedia and see like, oh, it has to penetrate this amount and be fired at this range. That all kind of operationally, that all kind of goes out the window a little bit. If we take a lot of the Piat actions in Arnhem, they're all super close range. Louis Hagen's firing out of a fair story window, distance of about 50 to 70 yards. Most of Major Kane's VC winning engagements are below 100 yards. Obviously, he had a lot more rounds and he got his eye in over the course of a couple of days. Because if you read that man's Victoria Cross citation, it's incredible. And if you dig deeper into the operation and how much the Piat was used, it becomes quite incredible. Major Lonsdale in the Oosterbeek perimeter says that they could have held out till Christmas if they had enough Piat rounds. That's in his actual after-action report. So you can see that they appreciated these weapons. They understood that they had their limitations like any weapon. If you used them in a clever way, you used them smartly, then they were very effective.
Matt, here's your chance. We're giving you the platform. What is the biggest or some of the myths that you want to see completely go away? This is your chance to address it.
I kind of alluded to it a little bit already, but it's the whole spring-loaded bazooka myth thing that surrounds the Piat, because the Piat is a much misunderstood weapon system. If you look at it from the externals or you just read about it a little bit of it online, there's, oh my God. Okay, so if you remember the History Channel, and there was a show called, I think it was called Weaponology, and there is a awful, really bad segment. There's an Israeli IDF soldier who clearly isn't familiar with the weapon. The Piat has a whole history with Israel and the IDF as well. It's instrumental as being one of the only really viable anti-tank weapons that they are going to have in 1947. And there's a lot of really interesting Piat actions that were used. The Piat does, I'm just going to go off on a tangent before I go back to the myths, but what a lot of people don't realize is that, yes, the British Army kind of understood that it was obsolescent by the end of the war, but it remained in service until 1956. It doesn't leave the list of changes until 1956. In the Korean War, most British troops in combat are issued the M20 Super Bazooka, which is the American 3.5-inch rocket launcher. And that's kind of what the British Army adopts in 1954 onwards. But we start using it in Korea. But Piats were in country. There is one photograph or one piece of footage of, I don't know whether it's Gloucester's, but it's the same brigade as the Gloucester's, and it's a chap walking down a road with a Piat on his shoulder. It's unmistakably a Piat. So at some point, there were Piats in Korea during the Korean War. That is something I'm trying to dig more into and find out more about and see what kind of scale of issue there were. I did find when I was writing the actual book itself, there was one account of I think it was a Royal Engineers Jeep going over in a ditch, and they were really annoyed because they had to put all the Piats back into the Jeep. So it was kind of like, it was just an off-the-cuff reference, and I was like, that's one of the few references to Piats actually being in country. But the majority of the Commonwealth forces were all using 3.5-inch rocket launchers at that point. Elsewhere, though, as I've said before, the IDF continued to use the Piat in 1947-48 during the War of Independence. In Indochina, we see the French using them against the Viet Minh, and then the Viet Minh using them against the captured Piats, using the Piats against first French troops, and then later, very early in the American involvement in the war, against American troops as well. There's a couple of good photographs of them in country. But yeah, getting back to the point about myths, it doesn't just stop being used in 1945. It does have a life post-war. So, weaponology, an IDF soldier that obviously works at an IDF museum or collection where they have one of the Piats that was used in 48. And what they end up doing is in this short little piece to camera, he shows the operation of the Piat in the most completely incorrect manner. The weapon's already cocked, but what he does is he pulls out the cocking rod at the back and has the butt piece, which it should be sat in the shoulder, well back over his shoulder, and he kind of seats it like a Carl Gustaf or a bazooka or like a law. He puts it on his shoulder and he puts the pistol grip as close to his shoulder as he can and has hold of the front monopod. So when he pulls the trigger, spigot goes forward, and then the butt piece and the cocking rod could chunk forward as well and end up like hitting him in the back of the head. That one little segment from weaponology creates this whole, what the hell is this? Then there's a cut to a historian that goes, it was spring powered, it wasn't very good. So the Piat kind of got short shrift in that episode. And I think that did a lot of damage because outside of appearing in A Bridge Too Far, the Piat isn't really that well known. It's not something that most people will be familiar with. Most people's understanding of how the Piat works is from A Bridge Too Far. And everyone thinks of the Bring Up a Piat sequence. And what happens in that sequence? It misses twice. People just assume, oh, well, it wasn't very effective, was it? Not to argue the point too hard, but about 20 minutes earlier in the film, it does knock out half a Graveness column on its own, as it's coming over the bridge. As historically accurate or inaccurate that might actually be, I think there were some 6-pounders and some 75mm pack howitzers that had something to talk about in halting the SS charge over the bridge, but the Piat was definitely heavily used. So yeah, that's the biggest myth.
And this leads to my next question, which is, those of us that have watched the films, we've seen the memes. The Piat has kind of entered popular culture in our minds through popular culture with the films and the memes. And in your opinion, would it be known at all without the effectiveness of that popular culture, that connection?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think it would have been largely forgotten if it hadn't been in A Bridge Too Far. A Bridge Too Far is far from the first time it appeared in a film. As we all know on this podcast, Theirs Is the Glory has the best Piat sequence. 2 of them, actually. You get a great sequence on the march towards Arnhem where they engage like a flamethrower Char-B. It's something like that. And there's a chap that goes, can we have a crack at it with the Piat, sir? And the major goes, of course, crack on. And the Piat team goes off to the flank. Textbook. Piat team number 1 and number 2. Number 2's there loading, fires off 2 rounds, hits the tank, perfect. And that is a really good illustration of how quickly the Piat can fire, in the hands of a good team. But that did not cement itself in the popular consciousness in the same way that A Bridge Too Far did, because A Bridge Too Far is it's a quintessential, big budget, ensemble cast, iconic classic war movie. And that sequence where Anthony Hopkins calls Bring Up the Piat is just, him as Frost is one of the great performances in any war movie. That sequence alone just typifies the resoluteness and the stiff upper lipness of that situation where, oh great, a tank's coming again, bring up the weapon that can knock it out.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Bridge Too Far in that whole sequence is it misses on purpose. It's not supposed to hit in that sequence. That sequence wasn't necessarily based on anything true. It wasn't recreating anything specifically. It was, in that moment, it was signifying that things are going badly for Frost and the men at the bridge. That's the point in the film and in the defense of the bridge that things start to go badly. The Piat is shown as more than effective 20 minutes beforehand in another scene where it knocks out, a couple of half tracks. It's also really cool because if you read the program that came with, if you went to a screening, you could buy a program back in the 70s. Wish you could still do that now. But in the actual program, it tells you about some of the behind the scenes stuff. And the chap who fired the Piat, he could put a Piat round wherever Attenborough wanted. So he had to put the round exactly where the pyro was going to go off. So when he fires ahead of the tank, you can see that it hits just in like a little pile of rubbish next to a burning oil like barrel. That's hiding pyro. And you can see the bomb travel and it hits exactly where he's aiming. So the irony of that whole scene is that, yes, the Piat's missing for artistic purposes, but the guy firing it actually hits exactly where he's supposed to hit. That's one of the funny ironies of that. But I think you're bang on, and I don't think the Piat would be in the popular consciousness the way it is now. Bring Up the Piat has become this strange organic meme that I used all the time when I was writing the book. Whenever I post about it on Twitter, I would also always hashtag it Bring Up the Piat, because to me, that was the scene that made me think about it and think about writing the book. That was the scene that everyone thinks about when they hear the word Piat. Unless you're Australian, where in Australia it's called Projector Infantry Tank Attack. So it's Pitter rather than Piat in Australian service. Doesn't have quite the same ring, does it? Bring Up the Pitter.
No.
I think that film quintessentially cements the Piat, the psyche, be it for good or bad. And it's been in a dozen films since. It was in Paper Tiger with David Niven, where he knocks out an M3 Greyhound, which is mocked up to like a German half-track. It's in Warsaw 44, a Polish movie, where it's depicted as being used by the Home Army, which is really, really cool. And there's a host of other films that include it, which is quite amazing when you think about it, because it is such an obscure weapon. It's not, it's not one that you would think would be in a great many films, but obviously A Bridge Too Far is the most famous, and it probably always will be.
We're sort of getting to the end of the episode now, gents. So all I can say is thanks ever so much, Matt, for bringing us up to speed and setting the records straight as well on some of the myths about the Piat. Unfortunately, they are still out there and books are being republished with those same mistakes, unfortunately. But absolutely great episode. What'd you say, Kev?
Oh, absolutely. And Matt, where can our listeners find a copy of the Piat, Britain's anti-tank weapon of World War II?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on, guys. It's been to chat about the Piat. It's been a couple of years since the book came out, but I am slowly working on a more in-depth history of the Piat. Since I wrote the first one, I've spoken to so many more people. I've spoken to family members of people that worked at ICI that actually developed and built the Piat and the Bombard, and all kinds of really interesting information that's come out of that. So I'm hoping to publish something in a year or two, or whenever it comes out, which is a bit more in-depth and covers more of the actual use as well in the field. But at the moment, you can pick up my Osprey book on my website. If you want a signed copy, you can get it there, which is historicalfirearms.info. You can find it there, or there's also links to that on my other website, which is thearmorersbench.com, which is linked to my YouTube channel, where I've done quite a few videos on the Piat in film and other bits and bobs as well. So yeah, thank you again.
Thanks, Matt, again. Thanks to our listeners. It just remains for me to say time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. Gents, if you'd like to raise your glass, cheers.
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 Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support them on patreon.com.
Sorry, lads, I just literally grabbed a flag. It was a slow one, but I got him. Anyways.